what we're doing here, at least tonight, is we're continuing our series on I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And what we're doing is we're going through point by point. We're abbreviating, of course, quite a bit from the book, but I'll kind of bring you up to date as to where we are. As you remember, the four major points in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist are: does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And then, is the New Testament true? And we happen to be in point 4 right now. Is the New Testament true? In the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, it's much more detailed. There's actually 12 points, but here I'm summarizing just to keep things moving, and it's much easier to remember 4 than 12. And remember, this book can't be true, that's point 1, unless truth exists. And in our culture you hear what? Well, there is no truth, that's your truth, it's true for you, but not for me, all truth is relative. You got to deal with all those objections. We already have. Go back and get the earlier DVD. Then, this book can't be the Word of God if there is no God. And we've already given 3 arguments for the existence of God, a God beyond the world who created the world and sustains the world. And we've given these arguments without referencing the Bible. They are the cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments. Once again, go back and get previous DVDs if you want more on that. Basically, though, the conclusion to that is there is a being, a supernatural being, beyond this universe that brought this universe into existence, and that being is timeless, immaterial, powerful, intelligent, moral, and personal. Okay? And you don't need the Bible to know any of that. Then, the third point is, are miracles possible? Again, this book can't be true if miracles are not possible. If you believe what the modern skeptics believe, like David Hume, well, David Hume's not a modern skeptic, he was a skeptic that died in 1776, but modern skeptics believe what David Hume said, that you can't believe in miracles because, well, they're just not credible. And we went through a whole argument to refute David Hume, a number of DVDs ago, so you can get that. And we also pointed out that not only are miracles possible, the greatest miracle of all has already occurred, and we have scientific evidence for it, and that miracle is what? Creation. Genesis 1:1 is the greatest miracle in the Bible. If Genesis 1:1 is true, then every other verse is at least believable. Okay? It's at least believable. And we have scientific evidence that Genesis 1:1 is indeed true, that the universe did leap into existence out of nothing. Then and only then can we get to the meat of the argument here, and that is the New Testament true? Because the New Testament can't be true if truth doesn't exist, or if God doesn't exist, or if miracles are not possible. But if we can cover all those 3 points and point out that yes, truth does exist, it's absolute and you can know it, and this God that the Bible talks about does exist, and miracles therefore are possible, then you can look at the New Testament and see, did miracles actually occur after the first one, after creation? And why are we just looking at the New Testament? Because if the New Testament's true, you get the Old Testament thrown in. Why? Because if Jesus was who he said he was, God, then whatever God teaches is true. Jesus taught the entire Old Testament is the Word of God, therefore mark it down, it is. So if the New Testament's true, you get the Old Testament thrown in. And this is where we ended last time. We pointed out there are 2 questions for investigating the reliability of the New Testament. The first question is, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? And the second question is, do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? And we pointed out in a previous DVD, for those of you out there in internet land, that yes, we do have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents. Even though we don't possess the original, we know what the original said beyond any reasonable doubt, especially on all the major doctrines. Despite what a man by the name of Bart Ehrman teaches at UNC Chapel Hill. His book, Misquoting Jesus, has a lot of truth in it, but he comes to the wrong conclusions. He magnifies minor problems. We know what the original New Testament documents said on the major issues and even on most minor issues. There are very few things we're in doubt about. But the second question is the one we've been dealing with lately, and that is, did the original New Testament documents tell the truth? It's one thing to say you have an accurate copy, right? It's another thing to say, did the original tell the truth? And there we were giving 5 lines of evidence that yes, we can trust what the New Testament documents say. We call them the 5 E's. The first is we have expected testimony, and that deals with prophecy from the Old Testament. It also deals with the fact that the Old Testament appears to be true about creation, and it says maybe we ought to expect testimony about a predicted Messiah in the 1st century, because that's what the Old Testament seems to indicate. We covered that on a previous session. Secondly, we have early testimony. This is what we covered last time. That not only are the New Testament documents early. They're much earlier than most so-called scholars think. And we pointed out that the New Testament documents, virtually every one of them, must have been written prior to 70 AD. We did this in the last session, okay? We also pointed out, the 30, that they're eyewitness documents. They're not just documents made up many generations later. They never were that. They were written down by eyewitnesses or those that knew and interviewed eyewitnesses, like, for example, Luke, who says he interviewed many people who have written the accounts down of Jesus. We pointed out that there's eyewitness testimony, and then we pointed out some of the archaeological evidence that has been discovered that seems to confirm the New Testament. There's many archaeological discoveries that also confirm the Old Testament, but we're just dealing with the new here. And this is where we ended last time. We ended after eyewitness testimony. Today we're going to get into embarrassing testimony and excruciating testimony. Okay? That's what we're going to cover today. So let's talk about point 4, embarrassing testimony. We have expected early eyewitness testimony. Now, what's this idea about embarrassing testimony? There's a principle that historians use when they're trying to figure out whether or not an author is telling the truth. And it's called the principle of embarrassment. It goes like this. If there's something embarrassing to the author or authors in the text, it's probably true. Why? Because you're not going to make up a story that makes you look bad, right? In fact, even if you're writing a true story, the tendency is to leave that stuff out, right? You don't want to look bad even if it's true. Well, it turns out that the New Testament documents are filled with embarrassing details about the authors and even about Jesus. Let's take a look at some of them. First of all, embarrassing testimony about the New Testament writers. They depict themselves as dim-witted. You notice that? You notice how many times the New Testament writers seem to be bumbling fools. Right? They don't seem to know what Jesus is doing. They don't seem to know what Jesus is saying. They don't quite understand why he's even here. I mean, even Jesus tries to explain it to them several times, and they're like, gee, we don't know, right? I mean, they fail to understand what Jesus is saying. Several occasions, in Mark and Luke and John, we didn't know what he was saying. Also, they are uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus twice in his greatest hour of need. Stay up with me and pray. Please pray. Yes, we will, Lord. What do they wind up doing? They wind up conking out on him, not once, but twice in his greatest hour of need, just as he's about to be taken by the Romans and be crucified. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. Who buries Jesus? Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Now, who was Joseph of Arimathea? Anyone? Who did he belong to? The Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was basically the Jewish Supreme Court. And the Sanhedrin actually sentenced Jesus to die. Now, question. If they're making up a story about this crucifixion and this burial, why would they make an enemy or somebody from a council that was certainly an enemy of Jesus, why would they make him look good while they ran away? See, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they make Joseph of Arimathea the good guy? Doesn't make any sense. And also, why would they put Jesus in a Jewish tomb? What would the Jews have done if Jesus really was in a Jewish tomb, but he did not rise from the dead? What could the Jews have easily done? They could have gone to the tomb and opened it up and said, you're saying this guy Jesus has been resurrected? No, here's his body. You notice that the Jews never denied that Jesus was buried in a Jewish tomb. They never denied that. There's no other story from history that says, no, Jesus was buried somewhere else. Not only that, they tacitly admit the tomb was empty. How do they admit that? What's their excuse or what's their explanation for why the tomb is empty? Matthew tells us what the explanation is. The disciples came and stole the body, right? Now think about this for a minute. Oh, they stole the body while the guards were asleep. Think about this for a minute. Why is that not a good explanation? Because if you're a Roman guard and you fall asleep on watch, what happens to you? So sorry, Charlie, you're done, right? But secondly, why is it also a bad explanation? If you're asleep, how do you know what happened? Right? I mean, how do you know what happened? Well, we were asleep, see, and then the disciples came and stole the body, and then we woke up. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? Now, how do we know Matthew's not just making up that story about what the Jews said? Because Matthew would have lost all credibility with the Jews if it wasn't true. Remember, Matthew is the gospel that goes out to the Jews. If you read Matthew, you see how many times does he quote the Old Testament? He quotes it over and over again. And it turns out that Jesus is the true Israel in Matthew. He's the true Israel. Jesus does what Israel couldn't do. In fact, if you look at Matthew, the first 4 chapters or so, what happens to Jesus? Well, he's born. And where does he go after he's born? He goes to Egypt, right? He goes to Egypt, and then Matthew actually uses a quotation, I think it's from Hosea in the Old Testament. It says, "Out of Egypt I called my son," to prophecy about Jesus, right? But in Hosea, that doesn't apply to Jesus. That applies to Israel. God calls Jesus, or calls Israel, out of Egypt. And it turns out that Matthew takes that prophecy, applies it to Jesus, because Jesus goes down there to flee Herod, who wants to kill all the firstborn, right? And in previous centuries, Israel went down there to avoid what? Being killed as well, because there was a famine. So they go to Egypt. But then they come out of Egypt, and so does Jesus. He comes out of Egypt, right? And what happens when Israel gets out of Egypt? Where do they go? They wander in the wilderness. Now, by the way, the wilderness is not Mount Sinai. You cannot wander for 40 years on Mount Sinai, or in the Sinai Peninsula, I should say. That would be like wandering for 40 years in New Jersey, okay? It's not that big. You know where they wandered? They wandered on the Saudi Peninsula. And in fact, there are inscriptions on the Saudi Peninsula that you can even go to the Saudi Smithsonian, the equivalent of the Smithsonian, online and see these inscriptions that appear to be an ancient form of Hebrew. But the point is they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus comes back to the Holy Land, and he wanders in the wilderness for 40 days. And he's tempted by Satan, right? Turns out, well, the Jews appear to be tempted by Satan too, for all the nonsense they're doing while they're wandering on the Saudi Peninsula for 40 years, right? Then Jesus comes back across the Jordan, and he gives in Matthew chapter 5 the Sermon on the Mount. Now, what happens with Moses when he goes up the mount? God takes his finger and writes the 10 Commandments, right? Now, if you look in Matthew chapter 5, how many have a Bible here? Go to Matthew chapter 5. And it depends on your translation. The NIV actually cuts out a very important phrase. Some call it the nearly inspired version. All right? But I like the NIV because it's easy to read, and mostly it's right on. But if you go to Matthew chapter 5 now, this is the Sermon on the Mount. It says, "Now, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, 'Blessed are the poor in spirit.'" And he goes on. Does anyone here have the New American Standard? Go ahead. What does the New American Standard say? Very loud. No, right in the intro. In fact, let me just borrow it because I have the mic. That'll be easy. Stand by for Vectors, Victor. There it is. It says, "When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. He opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying, 'Blessed are the poor in spirit.'" Well, the folks who translated the NIV said, opened his mouth. Well, they don't need that. Of course he had to open his mouth to teach them. Right? But I think that's there for a reason. Why? Because when Jesus opens his mouth, it's like God opening his mouth. On Mount Sinai, God speaks and writes the 10 Commandments into the mountain. On the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus opens his mouth, and his words are equivalent in their authenticity and power to those of God. See the parallel through Matthew? So Matthew, let's come back to where we started. Matthew's writing to the Jews. He's trying to show people that Jesus is the real Israel. The last thing he would do would be to lie about what the Jews or what happened to Jesus, referencing that Jesus was buried in a Jewish tomb, because if he wasn't buried in the Jewish tomb, every Jew would have known it and said, we can't believe this guy Matthew. Not only that, there are ancient church fathers who wrote that this was the explanation that the Jews used for the first 2 centuries of why the tomb was empty. They said, they kept saying that the disciples came and stole the body. They're obviously not making that up. Also, they all rebuked, the disciples are. Another embarrassing detail that they wouldn't have made up. Peter's called Satan by Jesus. Do you think they made that up? I mean, Mark, who's writing this down, you think Mark would have made that up and said, yo, Pete, I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan. What'd he say? You think Peter would have been for that? No. Also, Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that he went and told Peter to his face that he was wrong for trying to get the New Testament believers to obey the Old Testament law. Now, wait a minute. Isn't Peter supposed to be the first pope? Right? Now, I know papal infallibility didn't come till much later, but this doesn't look good for the first pope. Here comes Paul trying to tell Peter that he's wrong about a theological issue. And he says, I told him to his face that he was wrong. He rebukes Peter. Now, if they're making up a story, if they're making up a new religion, why would they say these things? That they had a theological dispute. Why would the story about Paul and Barnabas be in there? Remember, they had such a sharp disagreement that they split. This stuff is in there because this is really what happened. Okay? In fact, if you notice, half at least, maybe more, of the New Testament epistles or letters are all about problems. You notice that? Yep. Like Corinthians, it's a problem, sexual immorality in the church, so Paul writes 1 Corinthians. There's a problem also, still in the Corinthian church, it's called the fact that they don't think that Paul is a true apostle, so he writes 2 Corinthians to show them that he is. Then there's all sorts of legalism going on in the Galatian church, so he writes Galatians. There's a whole number of heresies in the church at Colossae, so Paul writes Colossians. And Peter realizes that there's suffering all over the ancient Christian world. So Peter writes a secular letter, easy for me to say, a letter that went from church to church, called 1 Peter. Now notice, if you're making up a new religion, you don't have these problems. Everything's fine, right? Come join us, we're good. But no, Paul and Peter write letters to people, rebuking them for getting things wrong, addressing problems that all the churches had. And you notice that the problems that they had 2,000 years ago are the same problems we're having in the church today. We still have legalism. We still have sexual immorality. We got plenty of that. We still have all sorts of heresies all over the place. Not in this country, but in other countries they're suffering. That's why these letters are still relevant. Still about the same issues we're all dealing with. But if you're making up a new religion, you don't have such problems, do you? You just say everything is fine. Also, they are cowards. This is very embarrassing, right? Because Peter denies Christ 3 times. What does he say before any of this happens? Lord, I'll never deny you. Right? But before the rooster crows, he denies him 3 times. Also, the disciples run away. This is like a Monty Python movie, isn't it? Run away! They all run away. Now, who are the brave ones? Ladies? The women, right? The women are the brave ones. The women are the brave ones while the sissy pants men run away. Now, who wrote this down? Men. Now, what man is going to write down that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Is any man going to do that? Are you going to do that here if you were a man? No way. Now, if I were making up a story about this, here's how I'd write it down. I'd write down, look, we marched right down there and moved that sissy Roman guard out of the way. Yeah, that sounds good. And then we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. Yeah, that's real good. But I would never say that I was hiding for fear of the Jews while the brave women went down and discovered the empty tomb. Never. I don't think any man in any generation would. And by the way, why would they even say women were the witnesses at all? Because in that culture, a woman's testimony was not on par with that of a man. So you would never say that the women were the first witnesses unless it really happened. And all four Gospels say the women were the first witnesses. Now, a couple of services ago, we talked about a creed in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. A creed that was orally remembered, and it goes all the way back close to the crucifixion and resurrection itself. And in that creed, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, Paul lists, I think, about 19 people by name. But who does he leave out? The women. Now, why does he leave out the women? Why does he say that Jesus appeared to all the apostles, then he appeared to James, then he appeared to me, and then he doesn't mention the women? I think when you add the women in, it's 19. Why does he mention the women? Because it was not in the creed. And they didn't put it in the creed because it wouldn't have added any value, it wouldn't have added any more authority to the creed to say, and Mary Magdalene saw him too, and Mary saw him too, and wouldn't have added anything, so it's not in there. But the Gospels, which are historical accounts, say, no, they were the first witnesses. Goes to show you, they're telling it like it happened. Also, they are doubters. Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. They don't believe it. The men certainly don't believe it. The women are going down to check the empty tomb, and the men are like, oh, these emotional women. Come on, he couldn't have risen from the... What are you going down there for? It's crazy. Not only did they doubt before the resurrection, they even are doubtful after they see him. See that verse up there? Matthew 28:17. What's interesting about that verse? It's only 2 verses before what? The Great Commission. In other words, Jesus is about to ascend to heaven. He's up on a mount, and all the disciples apparently are there, and they're all looking at him, and here's what it says. This is right at the very 2 verses before the Great Commission. It says, then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Some doubted? Then he goes on to say, as we all know, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching you to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. They're doubting. They're doubting. They see him there. Would they make that up? No. But I think it really happened. Why? Because if I was there, I'd probably be one of the ones doubting. I'd be looking over at Jesus going, are you sure that's Jesus? Yeah, man, I'm telling you, it's Jesus. Oh, come on, it can't be Jesus. He was dead. I saw him. He was killed. Everyone I know who's dead who's killed is still dead. No, I'm telling you, man, it's Jesus. Come on, it can't be Jesus. No way. It's Jesus. How do you know it's Jesus? The women told me. Not only are there embarrassing details about the folks that wrote it down, but there's even embarrassing details about Jesus. Now, there's a common theory among liberal scholars that the whole deity of Christ idea came much later. In other words, these writers didn't really think that Jesus was God. It was made up later, when, it got a little bit exaggerated. Jesus never claimed to be God, never thought he was God, and it all developed theologically later. We're going to answer that in the next session. But if these writers, and some of them, particularly John, are told or thought by these liberal scholars to have made up Jesus being more divine than he is, if that's true, then you can't explain why they say these things about Jesus. Here are some of the things said about Jesus, recorded by the gospel writers. Jesus is considered out of his mind by his own family, who come to seize him and take him home. In John 3, they think he's nuts. His own family. You think they're making that up? You think if they were trying to make Jesus look like God, they would include in there that his family thought he was nuts? Also, he's deserted by many of his followers, right there in John. Now, John is supposed to be the guy who's making up all this deity of Christ stuff, according to these liberal scholars. Yet John is the one that says, a lot of people didn't follow him. In fact, he says in John 6, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot be my disciple. And what does it say? In John 6:6, many said, this is a hard teaching, who can follow it? And it says many followed him no more. Many of his own disciples followed him no more. Now, who would have made up the communion? Would anybody make that up? Eat my flesh and drink my blood? This does not appear to be a made-up thing that somebody would say, especially if you're trying to say that this guy is God incarnate. Also, he's not believed by his own brothers in John 7:5. This is one way we know that James didn't believe in him, right? Not believed in by his own brothers. This is very embarrassing for a rabbi not to have his own family and his own brothers believe in what he says. Now, I can understand James, right? Not believing that Jesus was God. Do you have a brother that thinks he's God? Yeah, you might, right? You don't believe it. Well, James didn't believe it either until apparently, as Paul points out from the Creed, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3 to 8, that the Lord appeared to James. What happened to James? Anyone know? Church history. What happened to him? He went to Jerusalem. He became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Now, there's one place you can't have a church if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and that's Jerusalem. Because everybody would know that this guy did not rise from the dead if he really didn't. But yet here's James, the guy who didn't believe in Jesus, suddenly starting the church of Jerusalem and the leader of it. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that James was killed for his faith. He was martyred. He's thought to be a deceiver right there in John 7. He turns off Jewish believers to the point that they want to stone him. Go to John chapter 8 for a second, because this is a critical section of Scripture. And for those who don't think Jesus ever claimed to be God, all you need to do is take them here, because he certainly claims to be God here. John chapter 8, verse 30, and if you look at verse 31, it says, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, he goes on, and they interact back and forth for a little while. And they actually say, in verse 48, the Jews answered him, aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon-possessed? So now, these are people that believe in him, and after he says a few things, they think he's demon-possessed. And then he goes on to say, I'm not possessed by a demon. And ultimately, it gets down to the point where Jesus says in verse 54, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. You remember from Isaiah that God says, I don't share my glory with anyone. Yet here's Jesus saying that God glorifies him. Keep going. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you. Wait a minute, this is Jesus talking? Yes, Jesus was very direct, and he called people liars who were. But I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. Then they say, you are not 50 years old, the Jews said to him, and you have seen Abraham? I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. Now what's he doing here? What's he quoting from? He's quoting from Exodus 3:14, when God appeared to Charlton Heston after Moses said, who should I say is telling me to go to Egypt? What should I tell Pharaoh? Who are you? And God says, I am that I am. In other words, I am the self-existent one. I am. I just exist. Wow. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses don't think Jesus was God. How many have had a Jehovah's Witness at your door? Be nice to Jehovah's Witnesses. Invite them in. Talk to them. I was talking to a Jehovah's Witness, and they had come back several times, and we got down to the point of the deity of Christ. You got to stay on one issue with them, because they've got this cookbook recipe thing they try and take you through, you know. Let's just talk about the deity of Christ. Was Jesus God or not? That's really the main point, right? Because they deny it, we of course say he was. So we got to this verse, and he said, oh no, Jesus is not saying, I am that I am. He's saying, I am becoming what I am becoming, or something like that. I'm like, Jesus was not Shirley MacLaine. What are you talking about? But he said, no, that's what it means. So I went back in my office and I pulled up my Logos software and I said, let's go look and see what Jesus is actually quoting from. And I said in the Greek, the words are ego eimi, which means I am. Imagine that. And he said, but you can translate it, I am becoming. I said, okay. Let's go see what words are used in Exodus 3:14. Well, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew. Yes, but the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew to Greek by some scholars back about 250 BC. And Paul quotes from the Septuagint frequently, so it's a very authoritative translation. So let's go back and see what the Septuagint says in Exodus 3:14. And the words in Exodus 3:14 are the same words in John 8:58, ego eimi. So I said, I don't care how you translate it. He's using the proper name for God. He's using the name God used in Exodus 3:14. He's using it in John 8:58. He looked at ego eimi and he went, and he never came back. All you can do is lead a horse to water, right? All you can do is show him what it says. This is what it says. He's claiming to be the self-existent one, which is why in the next verse it tells us, at this day, the Jews who were believing him to this point, picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. Why did they pick up stones? Because they knew what he was claiming. It's blasphemy to claim to be God. Why is it that modern scholars are trying to tell us that Jesus never claimed to be God when all the people who were around Jesus knew what he was claiming? That's why they picked up stones to stone him. That's why Caiaphas tore his robes when Jesus said, I am the Messiah. Because he knew what that meant. Also, Jesus is called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And he's crucified, despite the fact that anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse, according to Deuteronomy 21:23, repeated in Galatians, by the way. If you're making up a new religion about a Messiah to the Jews, you would never have this Messiah hung on a tree. Because the Old Testament says that anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. So if you're trying to make something attractive to the Jews, you don't have the Messiah hung on a tree. Yet that's exactly what happened to the Messiah. Well, he was under God's curse, actually. That's why he was hung on a tree. What curse was he under? Yeah, the curse that you and I put him under. Our sin was a curse on him that he paid for. I'm sure you've seen the movie The Passion. The only place Mel Gibson appears is where? No, his hands. His hands are the hands that nailed Jesus to the cross. And they asked him, well, why did you want to be in there? I mean, you didn't even see your face. I just wanted to be in there because I helped put him up there. I wanted my hands to nail him to the cross. So we have expected testimony, early testimony, eyewitness testimony, embarrassing testimony. One more note about embarrassing testimony. This obviously is not a made-up story or a made-up religion. There's too many embarrassing things in there. Now think about the Old Testament too. This is true for the Old Testament, right? Think about the Old Testament. How many times did the Jews blow it? Over and over again. This is not like a history from, say, Egypt. What happens to the historians who write for the Pharaoh if they put something in the history that is embarrassing to the Pharaoh? They're toast, right? In fact, that's one of the arguments some of the folks say that is an argument against the Exodus ever occurring, because there's nothing in the Egyptian record about the Exodus occurring, official Egyptian records. Well, why would you expect it to be in there? Think about it. Pharaoh's going to say that he had his butt kicked by some nomad wanderer with a staff who never had an army, who just walked in and said, let my people go, and Pharaoh gave in? Think he's going to just say, yeah, that's what happened. Couldn't do anything about it. Started raining all sorts of plagues down on me. I guess Ra, the Egyptian god, is false, and Yahweh is the true God. No, he's not going to say that. And David, who would make up a character like David? Think about it. If David were here today, we'd lock him up. But this guy's supposed to be after God's own heart, right? David is a liar. He's an adulterer. He's a murderer, but he's after God's own heart? Oh, please. This isn't made up. All the warts of the authors and all the warts of the characters of the Bible and all the warts of the Jews and all the warts of the disciples are all over the text. Because that's what really happened. Let's go to excruciating testimony. This is Peter being crucified upside down. They went to their deaths for saying that all this had occurred. Look at what they did. We'll come back to this in a second, but look at what the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection were. Before the resurrection, they believed in animal sacrifice. Afterward, they said, no, Christ's sacrifice was sufficient. Before the resurrection, they believed in a binding law of Moses. But after, they said, no, Christ's life is sufficient. The law of Moses no longer applies to us. We have a new covenant, a better covenant. Christ already fulfilled the old covenant. Remember, he said, I did not come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it. He did fulfill it. So, because we can't, he did. But now they don't have to be bound by that law of Moses. In fact, before they believed in strict monotheism, afterward they believed in a Trinity. You say, well, the Trinity's taught in the Old Testament. Well, there's hints of it in the Old Testament, but not explicit. Now suddenly they're Trinitarians. Where did this come from? Before they believed in the Sabbath, afterward they said, no, we're going to worship on Sunday, which happened to be a work day. They thought they could go to hell. They could be killed for disobeying the Sabbath. But now suddenly the Sabbath's gone, and now they're worshiping on Sunday. Now there was some dispute That's what Paul's dispute with Peter was about in Galatians 2, we've already mentioned. But this transition to these new beliefs went pretty quickly. Here's another one. They believed in a conquering Messiah, that this Messiah would come and free the Jews from the Romans. But after Jesus, they believed in a sacrificial Messiah. Jesus will come again to set everything straight, but he didn't come to set everything straight, at least with the Romans, when he came the first time. Before they believed in circumcision, afterward they said, no, baptism and communion will be enough. Now, how did they go from everything on the left to everything on the right if the resurrection did not occur? Why would they do that? They already thought they were God's chosen people, right? They didn't need a new religion. They didn't need a new system of beliefs. They thought they could go to hell for disobeying the stuff on the left there, the beliefs on the left. Now suddenly, bang, now they're over here on the right. What happened? Something psychologists call an impact event. What's an impact event? An impact event is something that happens in your life that impacts you to such a degree that you can do a 180-degree turn in terms of your attitude or in terms of your belief immediately. Examples of an impact event might be, say, a heart attack, right? Heart attack victim. Before the heart attack, the guy's smoking, he's not eating right, he's not exercising. After the heart attack, he's suddenly Jack LaLanne, right? Some of you are going, who's Jack LaLanne? Jack LaLanne is like 90 years old now, and he'll still kick your butts in here, okay? Oh, he's a workout expert. Remember Jack LaLanne from the old days? Rick says, I'm not that old. Come on! A heart attack will turn you overnight into a fitness expert. Impact event. Other impact events. For those of you old enough, not you, Rick, I know you're not. Where were you November 22nd, 1963? Biology. You were in biology class. Where were you? Music class. 1960. You were in the kitchen. Where were you, sir? Do you remember? Riding down the street. Why is that date important? Why do you remember it? President Kennedy was assassinated. Now, if I asked you where you were November 22nd, 1964, you'd go. But 1963, you know, because it was an impact event. It's my earliest memory, because I remember I was only 2 years old, and I was standing in the living room, and my mother was sitting on a chair, and the TV was on, and she was sobbing uncontrollably. Mom, what happened? President. I didn't know what the president was. I didn't know any of this. But I can still see her crying. I was only 2. Where were you when the Challenger exploded? You know? You knew where you were, right? Where were you? Hospital. I was in flight school in the Navy in Moffett Field, California. Came back from a flight, walked into a house that I was renting out with 2 other guys, and they had the TV on. I looked at them, I said, what's going on? He said, the Challenger exploded. I looked at the TV, President Reagan was looking like this. Remember that? Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? You know where you were? You knew exactly. I know who I was on the phone with. I was on the phone, I had the TV on, I'm saying, yeah, something's going on here. And a guy was asking me to come speak up in Huntersville. And he said, what do you want to speak on? I go, apologetics. And then I turned from the TV, and he goes, another plane just hit the other tower. I said, what? Turned around, saw that one on fire. I said, really? He said, yeah, I just saw it. I'm telling you the truth here. I told him, we're going to talk about Islam. Because then I turned around, And the guy on CNN actually said, one has to think there's some sort of navigational problem. I said, navigational problem? Broad daylight, 2 planes hit the World Trade Center. There's no navigational problem. This is terrorism. In fact, I don't think I said Islam at the time. I think we're going to talk about terrorism. I called them back later and said, it's definitely got to be Islam. Now, why do these events impact you? Because they're emotional. Do you have any problem remembering any of these things? No. You remember them better, say it was 40 years ago, you remember that experience better than what happened 40 minutes ago. You know? Why? It's an impact event. Now, do you think that the guys, if there really was a resurrection, you think they would have had any trouble remembering what happened when they saw Jesus or what he was saying after they saw him resurrect? You think they would have had any trouble remembering? Do you think they would have had any doubt about moving from on the left to on the right? The only way they would have done that if there was an impact event like a resurrection. I think a resurrection would be a very significant impact event. Like if my grandfather walked in here right now, who's been dead for 30 years, right? That'd be an impact event. I wouldn't like say, well, good to see you, Grandpa, and then forget I saw him, right? Would you? Impact event. Now, also, if they had the Holy Spirit help them remember, as John says, that the Holy Spirit did help them remember everything I told you, then they could have written this down 50 years later if they had wanted to. I think it was written down before then, but they could have and still remembered, right? Let's talk about the question, what did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? What did they have to gain? They already thought they were God's chosen people in Judaism. They had nothing to gain by making up a new religion. Also, they had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. See, because by saying it did, just from an earthly perspective, what happened to them? They got beaten, tortured, and killed for saying Jesus had risen from the dead. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks, okay? That's not something you look for in your benefit plan at work. Let's see, we get health benefits, we get disability, and we get beaten, tortured, and killed. Good, sign me up! No, that doesn't happen, right? Obviously, they're not making this up. Now, a lot of people have trouble. In fact, this is one of the objections you'll hear. Well, you can't trust these documents here in the New Testament because these folks were biased. Right? They were biased. It means you can't trust them. Is that a good argument? Think about it. What bias would they have had to write this down if it wasn't true? See, they had to have a lot of guts to write this down. Even if it was true, which it was, right? Had a lot of guts to write it down because they know by writing it down and saying they believed it, what would happen to them? I mean, people say, whoa, you got to get some non-Christian sources here because you can't trust these Christian sources. In fact, I remember a Discovery Channel so-called documentary on Jesus. In the very beginning of the documentary, the narrator came on and said this. He said, most of what we think we know about Jesus, we know from the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But since those Gospels were written by the converted, we can't trust them for accurate information. Now, what's the problem with that logic? The problem with the logic is it fails to ask the question, why were they converted? Why were they converted? Why did they go from pious Jews to now suddenly believing this guy had risen from the dead? What motive did they have to believe that unless it really happened? If you can't believe what these people said, then you can't believe anything from ancient history. Also, if you can't believe what somebody says because they have an agenda or are biased, then we ought not believe anything the survivors of the Holocaust said. Why? Because, they were biased and they had an agenda. Right? No, having an agenda doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to lie. In fact, it may actually drive you to be all the more meticulous and accurate with what you're saying so people don't dismiss what you're saying. The Holocaust survivors were very meticulous in recording what happened because they never want it to happen again, A, and B, they don't want you thinking they're lying because that will dismiss A, right? That'll prevent, or that may actually prevent you from believing what they're writing. Also, do you notice that anybody who writes anything has an agenda? I mean, you don't just sit down and start writing for no reason, do you? When you write something, you have a reason to write. All authors have an agenda. But that doesn't mean that all authors lie. If that were the case, you couldn't read anything by an atheist and believe it. Because they have an agenda, don't they? They're trying to tell you that atheism's true. Well, how come if a Christian tries to tell you that Christianity's true, you can't trust him, but you can trust an atheist who says that atheism is true? Because that's his agenda. See, the issue is not the agenda. The issue is the evidence. Look at the evidence and see if the evidence supports one position or another. Every writer has an agenda. That doesn't mean what they say is fatally flawed. In fact, why would they die for a known lie, these New Testament writers? You say, wait, Frank, I know many people who die for a lie, and that doesn't prove that it's true. For example, we've been talking about Islam. These folks die. You're not suggesting that martyrdom proves Islam's true, are you? Because if martyrdom proves Islam is true, and martyrdom proves Christianity is true, you already said in an earlier talk that opposite ideas cannot be both true at the same time and in the same sense. The Quran says Jesus never died. The Bible says Jesus died and rose from the dead. They both can't be true. Law of non-contradiction. Remember that lesson? Yeah. What's the difference between the martyrs of the New Testament and the martyrs of Islam today? The martyrs of Islam today just have faith that they're going to get the 72 virgins or whatever if they die as a martyr. They don't have any evidence that that's true. But the New Testament writers were eyewitnesses of what happened. They saw Jesus, they touched Jesus, they ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. They had better proof than we have now. They were there. And yet they went and died for it. Many people will die for a lie they think is the truth, but nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. The New Testament writers were in a position to know that it wasn't a lie. They knew that Jesus had risen from the dead because they verified it themselves. The Muslim martyrs today, they have no idea. They just have faith. Ergen Cantor, who's a Muslim, former Muslim, now teaches at Liberty University. He's the dean of the seminary there. And he is a straightforward, direct, in-your-face Christian who goes out and speaks out against Islam. He's had death threats. But Ergen Cantor makes this observation. He says, you ever notice? There's nothing in Islam about what the women martyrs get. Because 50 virgin men to a woman is not a reward. He said, that's annoying, right? That's like going back to high school. Get away from me, right? No extra charge for that. So what's the summary? The evidence in the New Testament is true. We have expected, early, eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating testimony. Bottom line is, the New Testament's historically reliable. It's fact, not fiction. If it says Jesus said it, then Jesus really said it. If it says Jesus did it, then Jesus really did it. We have no reason to doubt what the New Testament documents say. And another point, remember, these documents are not a big church fabricated documents. They were written by 8 or 9 different authors over a period of 20 to 50 years at different times in different places. So you have to look at these documents as testimony from different people. It's not just like it's in the Bible, so it's one source. No, it's not one source. There are many sources of testimony in here. We have no reason to doubt it. Now, does this necessarily mean the Bible's inerrant? No, we've got more work to do on that. And we'll do that another time. In fact, next time we're going to get to the questions, so what? So what if it's true? Big deal. Who cares? What does it matter? That's what we're going to cover next time. We're running a little long here. I'll just take a couple questions if anyone has a question. Yes, sir. No, New Testament was written in Greek. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic in Daniel. There's a little section in Daniel which is Aramaic. So New Testament's written in Greek. Most scholars, however, believe that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, which means when you're reading the New Testament, even in Greek, you're already reading a translation, which is not a problem, because translations are there because you can transfer truth from one language to another. So you're already reading a translation probably of what Jesus said, even if you know the New Testament Greek.